How are you there? Economic Structural Adjustment Program, ESAP in Zimbabwe from 1990 to 1995. This is the topic that has been banging in my head or banged by the Lord in my head for the past 3 days. I had to get deeper into it and to see what we can extract from ESAP that could help us, find the path forward. It turns out that the problem that we currently face in Zimbabwe can be traced back to the IMF sponsored Economic Structural Adjustment Program in Zimbabwe from 1990 to 1995. And today, in 2023, we still face the effects or the aftershocks of that economic adjustment program that left Zimbabwe's economy in ruins. I am going to give credit to some of the sources that I used here. Uh, One of them is Patrick Bond. All right, Professor Patrick Bond, Bankrupt, Bankrupt Africa, Imperialism, Sub-Imperialism, and the Politics of Finance. So I want to read about ESAP. After God kept on saying ESAP, ESAP, for the past 3 days, the Spirit of God has been saying ESAP, 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 ESAP. So I will dig on ESAP, on what it is. Well, I always knew what it was, but I never had an in-depth, you know, look into it. And I want to highlight that our current problems are because of ESAP and how we can go forward. I also read something from let me see, Guy CZ Mahone, the impact of structural adjustment on the urban informal sector in Zimbabwe. Also, I read on the Economic Structural Adjustment Program, the case for Zimbabwe, 1990 to 1995, A.S. Mlambo, and also took a look at Zimbabwe National Industrial Development Policy, 2019 to 2023, and also some work by my new favorite Zimbabwean economist, Dr. Admire Maparadza Dube. He did a piece recently called Between a Zim Dollar Rock and the US Dollar Hard Place, analyzing Honorable Professor Mthuli Ncube's 29 May 2023 currency stabilization measures. And also, I listened to a lot of uh, uh, what can I say, voice clips or whatever. I listened to Dr. Admire Maparadza Dube on Twitter Spaces. The thing about Twitter Spaces, they can be recorded. So I heard him speak on one of the Twitter Spaces. I followed him and I checked on his Twitter page. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. So I borrow some of the information from him. So let us look at this ESAP. For those of you who do not know, maybe some of you know, but some people do not know. ESAP stands for Economic Structural Adjustment Program. It was not only done in Zimbabwe, it was done in other countries as well besides Zimbabwe. Basically, it's an austerity program. What an austerity program is, that it means that it it forces the government to restructure the nature of the market for certain IMF objectives, which is usually paying back the money that the government owes to the IMF. So here's a background story. The ESAP that happened in 1990 to 1995 and left the Zimbabwean economy in ruins, its story can be traced back from 1980 to 1989, when the ZANU-PF took over power from the Smith regime. the economy was controlled, heavily controlled by the government, and for the sake of improving the quality of lives, notably in the education sector, the health sector, and also in price control that brought food prices down or supported affordable food prices, and therefore also supporting industries that produce food and basic services. So there was heavy government subsidies there, and also the government job creation program of the 1980s. So we had a huge government in the 1980s, which was a good source for quality jobs in the country, and our industries were subsidized, so which means they were able to provide employment in the country. So in the 1980s, unemployment in Zimbabwe averaged less than 10%, which is a healthy economy anyway, considering that not everybody is part of the labor participation. So now, after independence, I remember in primary school when I started grade one, the we used to buy milk for 20 cents or something like that. But we were told by our sisters and brothers that them, when they started in the 80s, they were not buying that milk. That milk used to be given to them for free for every child. So this was a government program to support the social structure in Zimbabwe, to fight poverty. So the government was doing a great job in the 1980s. Okay. uh, I'm not going to talk about Kukra Wundi, but I know a lot of Ndebelets will talk about the 80s. The only thing they remember is Kukra Wundi, but I'm not going there. I'm just looking at the economy. And they say that Robert Mugabe did a stellar job from 1980 to 1989 in improving the quality of lives of the black majority, uh, improving the health sector by building a lot of clinics around the country, and expanding education, thereby improving education outcomes by building lots of schools around the country, and good quality teachers were produced during that time. All right. Now, with all these good things, why would the IMF recommend that Zimbabwe goes through ESAP? Now, I will tell you why. It's because all of these good things that the country experienced in the 80s cost something. And you know, they say in economics, there's nothing like a free lunch. Somebody has to pay for it. So the government paid through government deficits. Okay, or rather, the government deficits were financed through borrowing, and borrowing largely from the IMF and later on the World Bank. Now, so you're saying that all of these goodies that the country experienced was on borrowed monies, and therefore the government was not able to service its IMF debt. So, in the same time, our country was experiencing a current account deficit, meaning that the amount of goods that we were selling overseas were less than the goods that we were buying overseas. That led to a weakening currency regime. So, a weakening currency brought about higher inflation, and over time it made government debt servicing to be more expensive, because can you imagine if you are borrow, let's say $100, $100 this year. Now, because of inflation, if let's just say, for example, you borrow $100 and the value of your currency to the US dollar is 1:1, so you just need 100 Zim dollars to pay back that 100 US dollars, right? But if your currency moves from 1:1 to 1:2, you will now need 200 Zim dollars just to pay back your 100 US dollars. So, as we can imagine, as the currency was losing its value, the amount of money that the government needed to pay in US dollar terms was still constant, but in Zimbabwean dollar terms, it was much higher and unaffordable. So therefore, the government was beginning to default on its debt. So in order for the IMF to get back its money, it suggested that the government had to cut on its expenditures. So by cutting expenditure, uh, okay, there's two things that the IMF asked them to do. One is cutting government expenditure, and the other, from my research, is restructuring the market economy itself. As I told you that we had a current account deficit, meaning that we're not exporting a lot, we're importing more. That led to the weak currency. So in order for the government to rein in on the weakening currency, we needed to export more and import less. Why is that important? It is important because this is how the currency exchange mechanism works. It's about supply and demand. If we are buying more of outside, we need US dollars, right? So Zimbabweans go to the currency market with the same dollars to buy the US dollar. So the fact that you will have more demand for the US dollar to buy goods, yet at the same time you have got little US dollars into the country because there is little foreigners buying our goods using US dollars. So for us to get US dollars, we need to sell things. We need to sell our gold, our minerals, or agricultural produce. We get that US dollars. So it is that US dollar that we use to buy goods from outside the country. But if we have got less of the US dollar and there's more demand for the US dollar, the US dollar becomes more expensive to the people who are holding Zimbabwean currency. So that expensive, that the price of the US dollar, as it goes up, it means that the price of the same dollar goes down. That is essentially currency devaluation. And it has got a negative effect on the government's ability to service its debt. So these are the two things that we have to look at. I say that the government's deficit had to be cut down, and also the current account deficit has to be dealt with, so that we export more goods, meaning that we will get more US dollars than the US dollars that we require. So in that instance, where if we were to export a lot of goods, we get US dollars, more US dollars than we demand. So, due to the effects of demand and supply, the US dollar will be less valuable vis-a-vis the Zim dollar. So, the Zim dollar will gain value, making it easier for the government to repay its foreign denominated debt. And in that environment, it is easy for the government to just keep on printing money. Remember that uh, we can print our money as much as we want. Okay. So if our some dollar is gaining value because we are exporting more than we are importing, meaning that in the currency account market, actually, I want to clarify this because it's not always the case that when you export more than you import, your currency gets stronger. What really transpires is what really matters is what happens in the currency exchange markets, the demand and supply of the currency market itself, notwithstanding whether we export more or we import more. So if there is a higher demand for the US dollar in Zimbabwe, the Zim dollar loses its value. But if there is a higher demand for the Zimbabwean dollar, or very little demand for the available stock. Thank you, Lord, that's better. If there is very little demand for the abundant stock of US dollars, the value of US dollar itself in the country becomes weaker vis-a-vis the Zim dollar, which means that the Zim dollar is getting what? Stronger and stronger. So the IMF program was supposed to or intending to do that. Why is that important? If the Zimbabwean dollar gets stronger and stronger, one way in which the government can benefit from it is for the Reserve Bank to print more Zim dollars to buy the excess US dollars that are available in the market. And then the government will take that excess US dollars and pay back the IMF or to service its debt. And in that instance, you see that the government is just printing money and paying. At the same time, it doesn't hurt our exchange rate. Instead of the Zimbabwean dollar becoming stronger and stronger, which is also negative for industry, that printing of Zimbabwean dollar by the Reserve Bank to mop up the excess reserves in the system stabilizes the Zimbabwean dollar, okay, stabilizing prices and giving government a leverage or something. Okay, let me just say, giving the government a leverage to create extra, what you call it, extra Zim dollars that they can turn into US dollars and pay back the IMF debt. In that case, the payment back will actually be almost free because it doesn't cost anything to print paper, just Zimbabwean paper. So that was the intention of the IMF ESAP, like from purely from an economist point of view, who has got good intentions for the Zimbabwean government. And it did make sense from that perspective, and even perhaps at that time. So one thing that, so we have looked at this thing that the government had therefore to change the structure of industry. As I told you, that our industry was buying more from outside and selling less when out to the outside. And we had a protectionist policies whereby our local industries were supported by the government through subsidies. You understand? So these local industries, according to the IMF, they were unsustainable, and they were what word do they use? There's a word I forgot the word that I want to use. They were unsustainable, and something is, there's a special word that would really make it easier for you to understand, but I forgot that word. So since it was unsustainable, the IMF suggested that Lena government, you are giving money to these people. Yeah? So the IMF suggested, stop giving these industries money. All right. And if you stop doing that, you will be cutting on your government deficit. All right. And also find other ways of cutting your budget, including the the reduction of the size of government. Remember, when a big government employs a lot of people, so what happens now is that a smaller government cannibalizes employment in the system. So a lot of people that used to work for the government lost their jobs because the government had to cut down its costs. Right now, there is a negative effect of these things, and because also, when the government stopped supporting the industries therefore had to charge more. Remember, the reason why they're charging less is because they are subsidized by the government. So if the subsidies are removed, the industries, to order to recoup their capital, they have to charge more. So if local prices are higher vis-a-vis foreign prices, you see now where this thing is going. So now the local prices get higher. So now remember, the point of XUp was so that we buy more, sorry, we sell more outside and buy less from outside. But because now the government has to cut its support for the industries, because the government also has to reduce its expenditure. These companies now, the local industries, they have to suffer now because they have to ask higher prices. And by so doing, the local market, the local consumer, finds it better to buy from outside the country than from local industry. Okay. Now, so that competition from outside industries cannibalized Zimbabwe's local industries during the 1990 to 1995 period. That is when we had to put up industry are closing. People were losing jobs in the industries. Why were they losing jobs? Because the industries could no longer make money because people were no longer buying from the local industries. They were buying from foreign goods which are much cheaper. So if the industries are not making money, so they cut jobs. So now you see, we've got a situation where the industries are cutting jobs, and the industries are cutting jobs because they are now making losses. They have lost support from the government. The government is also cutting jobs because it wants to cut its own expenditure. It doesn't want to run deficits anymore. Now, you will begin to see that the effects of this thing is that the local economy suffers, the people suffer, they will get high unemployment, and this higher unemployment caused a lot of people that were employed in the formal sector now to go into informal sector. So now, when you what is an informal sector? It means ukuthenga uthengise kuyenda kujobheki unotenga zvinhu utengesa kuzimbabwe. That's not a formal job. You're just doing your own thing, your own hustling on the side. Now, according to this guy, who's it? Oh, to Guy CZ Mahone, who wrote The Impact of Structural Adjustment on the Urban Informal Sector in Zimbabwe, says that these guys that left the formal sector to become part of the informal sector, they made money because they were now self-employed, right? Now, because there's a lot of people, and by the way, they made money because they're unemployed, one. And who are their customers? Their customers are the people that are working in industry and in government. But as more people left industries and government, they also joined the informal sector, meaning that there's now more competition in the informal sector. Yet the customers are becoming fewer. Remember, the customers were government employees and industrial employees. So if the industrial employees are unemployed, the government employees are unemployed as well. You see that the customer base for the informal sector becomes shrinks, the market base shrinks. At the same time, the participants increases because all of those people that were employed by government and industry tended to join the informal sector, and that led to a poor performance of the informal sector itself because of that. So you see, everything is gets depressed. So in the 1990s, that is when we got to see, like, especially in Bulawayo, people started going to Johannesburg, to South Africa. So South Africa became a cushion for that. And I admire Maparaza Dube explains that in 1994, when Nelson Mandela took over democratic South Africa, he says it was a flood, it opened a floodgate for the Zimbabweans to begin to migrate to South Africa because the industry of South Africa was still viable and still taking employment or employing people who from the region. So we see that the effects of ESAP were detrimental to the Zimbabwean economy. Yet maybe the idea behind it might have seemed noble. So people can ask whether the IMF had a noble idea in helping the Zimbabwean government out, or it was one of those economic hitman strategies of showing you something that you think that you need, but in actual fact you do not need. Which brings me to a question. Uh, okay. So as we can see now, let me just refresh you that in the 1980s, when Robert Mugabe took over power, the mandate of his government was to make the living conditions of the black people better. They did good by expanding education, health, and infrastructure and supporting industries, local manufacturing industry to make life better for the people. However, all that was achieved at a huge cost to our borrowers. We begin to have borrowers like the IMF and the World Bank, and we're running a deficit. And because we had to maintain this newly found lifestyle, this lifestyle that came with liberation, it 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 uh, 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 it meant that we had to run this current account deficit, and this current account deficit led to the deterioration of our foreign exchange market, which means the Zimbabwean dollar was losing value. Because of that, it exacerbated the pressure on government's ability to service its IMF and World Bank debt. And therefore, as the debtors were all over Harare wanting their money back, I will argue later that I do not think that the IMF and the World Bank should exist so that they can make profit of poor countries or smaller countries, but rather they should exist to 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 edify the living conditions, or to help improve the living conditions of the population in small countries, to fight poverty, to fight unemployment, to have positive health outcomes. That should take precedence more than the country's ability or to pay back. So my point of view is that in 1989, when the IMF forced the government to install ESAP, the IMF should have realized that what is important for the Zimbabwean government to do is the welfare of its people more than the welfare of the IMF. Because if we take a look at where the IMF gets its money from, the IMF has got what they call special drawing rights, SDRs. These are actually currencies of the United States, Europe, and other members that participate, but largely it is the United States that contribute to those special drawing rights. And my question is, why does the IMF need to make a profit from borrowing to countries? Because that US dollar comes from the United States government, and the United States government got it from the Reserve Bank of America, and the Reserve Bank of America thought it got it out of the imagination of their foreheads. Yeah, wow, they are so brilliant. Fiat currency, essentially, that's what I'm saying. It's a fiat currency that is that, that is created by the Reserve Bank of the United States. Then it hands it over to the US government, who hands it over to the IMF, who hands it over to Zimbabwe. And what I'm saying, anyway, and then when it comes to Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe must pay back at prohibitive interest rates, very high interest rates, and a falling currency of a falling Zimbabwean currency increases the debt that Zimbabwe has to service to the IMF. My argument is that, why does the IMF want to make profit from that? Why do we have high interest rates anyway? Because if the IMF makes profit, the biggest majority or shareholder of the IMF is the United States government. If the United States government gets that profit, if let's just say that money was borrowed by the US government from the reserve, from the Fed, so they make profit from the money, then they pay the money back to the Fed. What does the Fed do with the profit? It doesn't do anything, because when the money goes back to the Fed, what the Fed does, it destroys money. Because remember, they have got the ability to create money and also the ability to destroy money through monetary contractionary policies. So here's the thing: the Federal Reserve of the United States does not exist to make a profit. To understand, it is a bank, but its mandate is not to make a profit. It has got a different mandate. It is to change the living conditions of the Americans. They have got a dual mandate, which is to fight inflation, to keep inflation at around 2%, and also to fight unemployment. So that is what the reserve, that is what they have in the United States. Well, they don't have a third one. There's a third one that is pertinent in central banking, which is control of the exchange rate. In the United States, that role is governed by the equivalent of the Ministry of Finance. They call it the Treasury Secretary. Okay. So the point I'm saying is that if there is if the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States is a bank, right? Just like the IMF is a bank. Is the Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States is a bank for the economic system of the United States. It exists to keep the health of the economic system of the United States intact, right? Low unemployment and lower inflation rate. Now, the IMF also acts as the reserve bank of countries. To understand, there is the difference between IMF and Federal Reserve. The IMF also creates money, just like the Federal Reserve. However, it will say, we've got SDRs, we don't create money, we've got SDRs, but SDRs are coming from governments who've got central banks that create money, fiat money from thin air. So you can say that this is actually created money, and that money is there to service the countries that it's purport to serve. Now here is the question to the IMF: why do you make importance your profitability as the IMF? Why is your profitability important instead of actually having the mandate of fighting poverty, global poverty, and things like climate change, or and reducing unemployment around the world, and helping countries deal with their exchange rate problems, more than desiring the countries to pay back the IMF? Because remember, the IMF and the Federal Reserve are the same. They don't lose anything from making losses. If the IMF makes losses, doesn't matter, because that money anyway came from their pigment of their imaginations, their own central banks. So I was listening to Jerome Powell a few days ago. He was testifying at the Capitol Hill, and they asked him about the profits of this of the his bank. He said that they made 2 billion. Did he say 2 billion or 2 trillion? One of those two, either 2 billion or 2 trillion. I can't remember. I think he said $2 trillion that they made as a profit, and he said that they gave it to the federal government. And he said that it is immaterial to them whether they make profit or they make losses. To understand, so they don't exist to make profit or to make losses. They exist to stabilize the market economy. So now the IMF as well ought to exist not to make profit from poor countries, but to stabilize the economies of these countries. So Zimbabwe's economy was okay in the 90s, just because Robert Mugabe and the ZANU-PF regime were not able to service their IMF debt. The answer is not to strangle them through austerity and making living conditions of the black people terrible, because Robert Mugabe has done a stellar job in improving education and health, and making food, and causing food to be affordable in the 1980s. So the problem that I have with the IMF is that this is such a good outcome, which what the funny thing is, that's what the Reserve Bank in the United States seeks to do. After the 2008 financial crisis, they started printing money to restore confidence in their own stock markets, and in order to reduce unemployment in the United States and to fight inflation in the United States. But they did that by expanding monetarily, and the US government's deficit has been increasing, and the US debt ceiling is ever increased every year. But the IMF is not asking, or there's nobody who's asking the United States government to practice austerity. To understand, because austerity is not the right thing to do. In fact, when the government is owing more and cannot service its debt, the correct prescription is to give it more debt. What the IMF needed to do in Zimbabwe was not to ask Zimbabwe to pay back all of its money. Because, in any case, if I had time, I will go on another. Let me just go off a tangent a little bit and say that for economy to grow, for economic growth to take place in any environment, there has to be more debt created. So, if a government pays back all of its debt, what that means that its GDP was just gonna go down to zero. Because what causes GDP to grow is more debt. GDP growth is fueled by monetary expansion. All right. So, so there's two ways in which the Zimbabwean government and economy got its money from. It's either it is from the local banking system, expanding the local banking system, or actually getting money eh, from the IMF. In which case, I'm saying the IMF is In this case, I'm saying that the IMF and the Federal Reserve in the United States are the same. They are both central banks. The first one is the Central Bank of the United States. The second one is the Central Bank for poor countries, because that is what the IMF is for poor countries. The World Bank for the richer countries. So a central bank's purpose is to make sure that the living conditions are improved, not that the people that owe money must pay back the central bank. Yes, of course, they must pay back, but not at the expense of penury. You don't put money people through penury so that they pay you back, but instead you support them so that they can pay you back. In the United States, they're too big to fail. The banks that are too big to fail. How were they saved? They were owing billions of dollars, ne? But the way that they were saved was the central bank of the United States giving them more money, borrowing them more. The the program went over 1 trillion US dollars, I think, to support JP Morgan and Chase, these Barclays, not Barclays, yeah, those AIG and who else? Nah, like those banks, those big US banks. Okay, Citibank and and the banks that fail, they fail because of a political decision. You know, which bank was it that, that Merrill Lynch failed because they decided not to give it money, but those that got money survived. All right. So what am I saying? I'm saying that if 2008 financial crisis was solved by giving these too big to fail banks more credit so that they will be able to get out of their over leveraged positions and get back to a positive balance, then why is it that in the late 1980s Zimbabwe are facing a same problem? Why didn't the IMF declare Zimbabwe a too big to fail a country? The economy of Zimbabwe was too big to fail the citizens of Zimbabwe. Therefore, the only way to save that economy is to actually give the Zimbabwean government more money. What we can really cut back on is on corruption, issues of corruption, issues of government expenditure that is wasteful. But government expenditure that creates employment should not be cut. Government expenditure that stabilizes food prices should not be cut. Government expenditure on education and health outcomes should not be cut, even if it means an increase in the government deficit. Just like the United States government also increases deficits every year. Okay, every year. They always speak about budget cuts, but they really never come to fruition. What happens is that the debt ceiling is always increased. So what I'm arguing is that ESAP was wrong, because what we needed was the opposite of ESAP, which is a further financialization of the system, which is a QE for Zimbabwe. That is what we needed to do. That what the IMF needed to do. But as I say, that this IMF bank does not exist to improve the living conditions of the countries that they serve, but instead to make profit, which is a wrong thing. Central banks must not exist to make profit. Central banks, like the IMF, must exist to improve the living conditions of the countries that they serve. But someone will say, well, the IMF is not a central bank. Essentially, it is a central bank. It might not call itself a central bank, but it is in that position where a central bank must be. It should not behave like a private individual. If a private individual borrows money to the government must pay that person back. And so that person's uh, reason for borrowing the government is a profit motive. So, but the United States central bank does not borrow the government because it has got a profit motive. No, QE 1, 2, 3, 4 did not happen because of a profit motive by the Reserve Bank. No, the QE 1, 2, 3, and 4 happened because they needed to stabilize the financial system of the United States and the economy of the United States. Therefore, even the same thing in Zimbabwe, that's what I'm arguing, is that more funding was supposed to be availed to the Zimbabwean government for the sake of stabilizing the financial system of Zimbabwe. So to get rid of those bottlenecks, okay, the IMF said our industry is unsustainable. 70% of our industry is unsustainable. So you need to give it more money, put more money in our industries, market our products around the world in more countries so that they can become more competitive and and rein in on unnecessary government expenditure and rein in on corruption. But the anchor should be maximizing employment in the economy and fighting inflation, even if it means further deficit and increased borrowing from financial institutions around the world. Now, which brings me to another point. Here's the point: if international institutions do not behave like a central bank to Zimbabwe, but behave like a private, what you call it, a private capitalist who borrows the government money and wants the money back, whether you like it or not, I'm going to take your state assets. If the IMF begin to behave like that, now this is the suggestion that I have for our governments to do. We need to restructure our debt, but listen very carefully. When I'm talking about restructuring the debt, the IMF, when it talks about that, it talks about changing the terms of payment, perhaps changing the maturities and stuff like that. I am talking about completely changing who owns the debt. Because the problem of ESAP, as I see it, is that is the owner of the debt was a problem, IMF and the World Bank. That is a problem. So we needed to change who owns the debt. Now we still have the same problem in Zimbabwe even today. We still owe 18 billion. That's what the government says. They say we owe 18 billion to other people. Now here's if I become president of Zimbabwe and I take office, this is what I would do with the 18 billion credit. What we need, Anyete, is to set ourselves free from these borrowers who ask us to do things that are detrimental to the well-being of our people, because their demands increase unemployment, increase poverty in our countries. So the government exists to fight poverty. That's the whole reason why we have a government. If the government is the one in charge of ESAP that increases poverty, increases the unemployment, then there'll be no reason for have a government in the first place, right? So now here is my suggestion. How do you change the owner of the debt? Let's look at the biggest superpower itself, the United States. How does the United States, how is it able to keep on paying its debt at the same time increasing debt all the time? But the United States is not running a balanced budget. They are always running a budget deficit, and the budget deficit is ever increasing. The debt ceiling is ever increasing. But they will never default on their debt obligations. Why is it that so? I'll tell you why it is. It is because of who owns the US debt, and also how that the relationship between the US government and the person who owns the US debt is different. The US debt is owned by market participants. The United States government does not go to any country to ask for money, or does not go to the IMF to ask for money. It goes to the market. All right, there's a difference, huge difference. I'm telling you, this thing is gonna make a huge difference. The United States government goes to the financial markets. Now, in the financial markets, anybody can borrow money to the US government. Anybody, doesn't matter who it is. So now, and since the people are buying the debt in the market, they can buy and sell it, they can trade it there. So if the guy wants his money back, they can just sell the debt in the debt market. Now, the problem with we have is that the structure of our debt is that it's IMF who owns who we owe IMF maybe 4 or 5 billion. We owe China 6 or 7 billion. So China now to get its money back, it has got a say in our affairs. How do we chop off the people's affairs? By having a market driven debt market, whereby if that 7 billion is owed by the Chinese, if they want their 7 billion back, they just sell in the treasury markets, and new entrants will come in, people who would want to get a yield from our debt. Because remember, one of the reasons why the government debt industry functioning is because of the yield that investors get. So now, if you have a, a relationship with few lenders like AMF, World Bank, China, Paris Club, whatever, these are few people, then there is a yield that they get, right? But now they have got so much power over our government because you want to ask for 3 billion from this one, 2 billion from that one, and then you have to agree, if I don't pay back your 2 billion, I will give you my gold mines and stuff like that. It makes the government become the beach of all of these foreigners. But the United States was able to go around it because now, if China wants its money back, remember that China bought uh, treasury bills in the United States. If it wants its money back, it doesn't go to Joe Biden and tell Joe Biden, we want our money back, or else you must do this infrastructure there in that county, or do this and that, or cut this spending on that. They cannot do that. What China does is just go to the currency market and just sell their debt. If they want to buy more debt, they just go there and buy more debt. So we need something that is similar to Zimbabwe. So here's the thing: we owe the world $18 billion, right? Here's what we do: we have our own treasury market in Zimbabwe, and then we issue 18 billion worth of treasury stock, okay, bond paper. Okay. I'm not confused. Zimbabwe bond paper means something else. Don't worry about that Zimbabwean bond. I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about government bonds issued in the debt market, $18 billion. And then we've got individuals who buy this in the market. Let's just say one is worth 100 US dollars. Okay, you can structure it in I'm still thinking whether it should be in Zimbabwean dollar or US dollar, but it will be best if it is in Zimbabwean dollar. Even US dollar, but there is merits and demerits of any of the two, but I don't want to get deeper there. Let's just say it's $100 each, and the investors, individual investors who don't care who they are, who don't even want to know who they are, just bring your money, then we give you a bond. You are a bond holder. 18 billion. We take all that 18 billion, we pay back China, pay back IMF, pay back World Bank, pay back the Paris Club. They are out of our asses. And then now the 18 billion, that is, we still owe this 18 billion, but now we have changed who we owe that 18 billion to. Now we owe the 18 billion to the market. Now there is not even one market participant who's going to be telling what the government wants to do. Though obviously the value of that bond is determined by the policies, the policy direction of the government, that the government is taking, and the government has to communicate with the market so that the market can be able to see which way are we going. Is this, what is the risk to their investment? So now the issue now, therefore, the government has to be concerned about sustainable debt repayment by running a, a, a system whereby our exchange rate is stabilized. If this local debt market is quoted in Zimbabwean dollars, then our central bank has to run a policy of stabilizing our currency, making sure that our currency doesn't fall a lot. Okay, and or is just stable. So in that way, we have done with the problem of Zimbabwean debt. We don't have to pay it back. United States owes how many trillions of dollars now? 31 trillion. They don't have to pay it back. All they have to do is just keep on increasing that debt ceiling all the time. We can even move from 18 billion to 25 billion, just over 25 billion. Yeah, yeah, that's it. That is done. Our problems are sorted out. Okay. So I'm going to talk a lot about the financial topics in the next few days. So I will cut this video here.